Our discussion today will be limited to the clavicle. Now, obviously, I've made a video about clavicle in my channel earlier, but this one will be a little different. How so? Today we will be revising the clavicle. So this will be kind of a rapidly recalling what we already know about the clavicle, right? So if you do not know anything about the clavicle or you haven't read about the clavicle, I wouldn't really suggest that you watch this discussion, because we'll be very rapidly covering the entire clavicle, and I would assume that you would probably not be able to keep up if you do not already know a bit about the clavicle. For the others, welcome. This is the rapid recalling of the clavicle bone features and attachments and all of the things that this clavicle bone has. So let's start. First of all, the features of the clavicle, they include the bony features of the clavicle. As we can already see, the shape of the clavicle is F-shaped, right? So if we assume that this is the medial side and this is the lateral side, then medially, in its medial 2/3, it is convex forwards, whereas in the lateral 1/3, it is concave forwards, forming a double bend F-shaped structure. This is the medial 2/3, and as we can already see, it is a little cylindrical or prismatic, whereas in the lateral 1/3, it is tapered, right, and flattened. This is the superior surface, this is the inferior surface. This over here is the anterior surface, and this is the posterior surface of the clavicle. So we are holding the right clavicle. But let's first get on with the features, and then we'll talk about the side determination. So as far as the bony features of the clavicle is concerned, we can see that it has two ends. This one is the sternal end, where it is articulating with this manubrium sterni and the first costal cartilage. This one, on the other hand, is the acromial end, where it articulates with the acromion process of the scapula. Now, the sternal end, as we can already see, it articulates with the manubrium sterni and the first costal cartilage. Throughout its entire periphery, it will give attachment to the fibrous capsule for the acromioclavicular joint, whereas above it will give attachment to the interclavicular ligament connecting the two clavicles on the both sides. Above and a little behind, on the other hand, it is giving attachment to a fibrous disc, which will divide the acromioclavicular joint into two compartments, making the joint a complex joint. All right. On the other hand, for the inferior surface of the sternal end, very close to the sternal end on the inferior surface, we have a little, you might say, spot or depression, where it is actually giving attachment to the costoclavicular ligament, connecting the first costal cartilage or rib to the undersurface of the clavicle. That's all about the sternal end. All right. Now, as far as the acromial end is concerned, as you can see, it is tapered and flattened, and it is articulating with the anterior part of the medial margin of the acromion process of the scapula. So that's more or less all about it. As far as the shaft is concerned, the intervening shaft, medial 2/3 cylindrical prismatic, lateral 1/3 is flattened. In the medial 2/3, we can see that in the anterior aspect, the medial part gives attachment to the pectoralis major muscle, whereas in the superior aspect, it is giving attachment to the clavicular head of the sternocleidomastoid muscle. All right. In the posterior aspect, on the other hand, it is giving attachment to a part of the sternohyoid muscle, whereas in the middle 1/3 of the inferior surface, it is actually having longitudinal depression for the attachment of the subclavius muscle. Now, this longitudinal depression on the undersurface of the middle 1/3 of the clavicle, that has two intervening lips, which on the other hand give attachment to the clavipectoral fascia. So the longitudinal depression itself gives attachment to the subclavius muscle, whereas the two lips, they give attachment to the clavipectoral fascia. All right. So that's more or less all about the muscular attachments of the medial 2/3. Again, I'm repeating. Anterior aspect, medial part. Anterior aspect, we're getting the origin for the pectoralis major muscle. Superior aspect, more or less in the, again, middle 1/3 or the medial 1/3, I'm sorry, we're getting attachment for the clavicular head of the sternocleidomastoid. In the posterior aspect, we are getting attachment for a part, or rather the origin of a part of the sternohyoid muscle, anterior triangle of neck strap muscle. And in the inferior surface, in the middle part, we are getting the attachment for the subclavius muscle, with the two intervening lips of the depression giving attachment to the clavipectoral fascia. All right. As far as the lateral part is concerned, the lateral 1/3, the anterior border and the adjoining superior surface, that is actually giving origin to the anterior-most fibers of the deltoid muscle, whereas the posterior border and the adjoining superior surface of the lateral 1/3 is giving insertion, I would say, to the anterior-most fibers of the trapezius muscle. All right, so these are more or less the attachments of the different muscles of the clavicle. Now, a very interesting thing to notice here will be that in between the deltoid attachment and the pectoralis major attachment, the part of the intervening shaft, that is actually forming the base for the deltopectoral triangle. All right, whereas in between the trapezius attachment and the sternocleidomastoid attachment, the part of the intervening shaft is forming the base for the posterior triangle of the neck. So these are two very important aspects of the clavicle attachment. Also, another important thing to notice is the part of the clavicle which is forming the base for the posterior triangle of the neck, that is also giving attachment to the two intervening lips or the two intervening lamellae of the investing layer of the deep cervical fascia, thus enclosing a supraclavicular space above. All right. Now, since we are talking about the lateral 1/3 muscular attachments, we have talked about that. Let's talk about the other thing about the lateral 1/3, that is the presence of a very distinct conoid tubercle on the undersurface of the lateral 1/3. Very distinct, the conoid tubercle. All right, this will also help us in determining what is the undersurface of the clavicle, helpful in site determination, and also medial and lateral determination. So this is the conoid tubercle located in the undersurface of the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. From the conoid tubercle, we have a ridge running laterally and forwards, which is the trapezoid ridge. The conoid tubercle and the trapezoid ridge, they provide attachment to the conoid and trapezoid parts of the Coraco clavicular ligament. The Coraco clavicular ligament is perhaps the most important ligament in the entire shoulder joint, because or in the entire shoulder complex rather, not the joint, because it is the actual ligament which is helpful in transmission of the weight or load from the upper limb to the lateral part of the clavicle, which on the other hand transmits the weight to the medial rounded part of the clavicle, which will transmit it to the axial skeleton. All right, so that is the path of the weight or force transmission. So that's more or less about the features and attachments of the clavicle. Now, clavicle is a peculiar bone, we say that, and the most important aspect of that peculiarity is that it is the first bone to start ossifying, but it is the last bone to actually end ossification. Also, it is a modified long bone. Long bone because it helps in weight transmission, obviously, that is a very important feature of any long bone, but modified because it is placed horizontally, which no long bone in our body is. Also, a very important aspect of the clavicle's peculiarity comes from the fact that the clavicle is crossed in front by the 3 supraclavicular nerves, right? the intermediate supraclavicular nerve might sometimes pierce the clavicle, which is also something very peculiar because the bone is not much pierced by a cutaneous nerve, but the clavicle is. Right? As far as the clinical part of the clavicle is concerned, it's pretty simple. The clavicle is probably the most vulnerable to fracture bone in our body. And the reason is very simple. First of all, the site which is the most commonly fractured part of clavicle is this intervening part in between the medial 2/3 and the lateral 1/3. This part. This is the most fractured part. Why? There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, we are seeing that there is a change in the direction of the clavicle, or the articulation type is changing actually. There is a change in direction from medial to lateral, it is changing. So that's why this makes this spot a little weak. Also, there is a change in the shape from the more flattened lateral part to a more cylindrical medial part. So that's also affecting their intervening part. But probably the most important aspect to its weakness can be attributed to the fact that there is no muscular or ligamentous support in this intervening part. The medial 2/3 has its own muscular and ligamentous supports, lateral 1/3 has its own, but the intervening part is somewhat bare. It's forming the base for the posterior triangle, the base for the deltopectoral groove, but it's somewhat bare and it is subcutaneous. That's what makes it very vulnerable to fracture. Now, as far as the anatomical position of the clavicle and site determination is concerned, as I've already said, we already know the features of the clavicle. So we need to understand that for medial and lateral determination, we can go for the coronary tubercle. The coronary tubercle will be located in the undersurface. By that, we'll be able to distinguish the undersurface from the above surface. And it will be located in the lateral 1/3. Also, the lateral 1/3 is flattened, as you can see. It's a bit broken. But the medial 2/3 is cylindrical and prismatic. Also, how do we hold the clavicle actually? We hold the clavicle in such a way that the sternal end, that's actually located a little to, obviously it's located medially, it's located a little towards forwards and a little downwards. And we hold it in a pen holding position like this. So this is how we'll hold the right clavicle. Alright, a little down, a little downwards and a little forwards. This is how we hold the clavicle. So I hope this was worth your time, this little revision thing, and I hope we meet again in some other video. Thank you very much. Hope to see you soon.